As way of introduction, my name is Chris Gorman. I'm a senior associate with Org Code Consulting, and I am super, super pleased to be moderating this session. I think it's going to be phenomenal. So there are 3 presentations. We'll aim for about 20 minutes each with questions at the end. And questions at the end sometimes can be answered by the wonderful folks on the panel, and sometimes can be answered by the wonderful folks in the audience. So if you also have expertise, I think we should not just leave that on the table. So before we begin, I do want to acknowledge that we are on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence reaches back to time immemorial. Their culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this land, and we pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So with that, I promised I wouldn't read any bios of the presenters, because if you've ever presented, that's the worst thing that can happen to you. To sit there while somebody reads a bio that you just wrote on probably the airplane on the way here. So I won't do that, but I will introduce our very first speaker, Kayla Gardner, who I'm not going to say anymore because this is her job now.
Prop this up.
Yeah.
All right.
Perfect.
That looks good. All right, so I guess I should talk into this. Thanks for coming to our session today. My name is Kayla Gardner, and I'm a policy analyst with the Aboriginal Housing Management Association. And today I'll be discussing one of our ongoing research and action projects. So it's called Exploring Inclusive Housing for Indigenous People with Diverse Abilities. So the Aboriginal Housing Management Association has 25 years of expertise in advancing housing rights for Indigenous people in urban, rural, and northern communities. AMA's members manage almost all Indigenous housing units located off reserve in BC. We administer funds in partnership with BC Housing for almost 10,000 Indigenous individuals and families living in urban, rural, and northern communities. Our housing providers build and operate trauma-informed, culturally safe, urban Indigenous housing solutions to foster more equitable, livable, and sustainable communities. The programs and services that our members provide include affordable housing, shelters, supportive housing, complex care housing, and assisted living facilities. So there's a broad range there. Many members also offer support services, including homelessness prevention, parenting skills, mental health programs, and substance use support. AMO is the first self-determined Indigenous housing association in Canada, and we're BC's for Indigenous, by Indigenous housing expert for those not living on reserve. And this is important because approximately 75% of Indigenous people in our province don't live on reserve. Decolonizing housing policies and practices is where our work on the policy team comes in. We work from the framework of being relational, communicative, and respectful. And we exemplify these values in our approach to decolonizing housing policies and practices. So just a little slide to show our overview today. We're going to be discussing a research-based project and the framework that was developed from the research. Just noting that this project was done in collaboration with Community Living BC, and I will refer to them as CLBC as well, and they're the provincial crown corporation in BC that funds and supports services to adults with developmental disabilities. So there's probably similar crown corporations in all the other provinces we have. So the environmental scan is called Exploring Inclusive Housing for Indigenous People Living with Diverse Abilities. And then the housing model that was developed during the project is a mouthful. It's called the Indigenous-led, culturally supportive, inclusive co-housing complex. And then I'll go over the next phase of this work. And I'd also like to point out that for the sake of this presentation, we're following CLBC's terminology of diverse abilities. However, we also use the term disability, and part of the next step is looking for a term based on Indigenous ways of knowing. So the project started because we noticed a gap in support for Indigenous people with diverse abilities. First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people living in Canada experience higher levels of disability overall compared to non-Indigenous Canadians. A study from 2017 found that 32% of First Nations people living off reserve, 30% of Métis, and 19% of Inuit had one or more disabilities that limited them in their daily activities. Also from the same study, First Nations people over the age of 15 living off reserve reported higher rates of learning, memory, and developmental disabilities compared to non-Indigenous people. As well, there remains little research to date which has examined Indigenous people's experiences of disability, including their experience in accessing housing and support services. Further to this, despite the need to transform housing services to be more culturally safe, there remains little research to date which has examined this issue within a Canadian context, and even less done in partnership with or led by Indigenous people. And lastly, there's a clear need to better understand what inclusive and culturally safe housing for Indigenous individuals with diverse abilities looks like in BC, so that this population can be adequately supported. So the purpose of the scan completed in phase 1 of the project was to examine Indigenous housing and how it intersects and supports Indigenous people living with diverse abilities in BC. It was guided by the following questions. So what does inclusive housing look like across Indigenous communities in BC? How are Indigenous people with diverse abilities being served in Indigenous and non-Indigenous housing? And what does culturally supportive housing for Indigenous people with diverse abilities look like? So the literature review and environmental scan included a review of academic and gray literature and a review of all active AMA providers. So our providers are housing providers, some friendship centers. And this included examining available resources on inclusive and culturally safe housing, including unpublished reports, articles, and then information from our member websites. In addition to all the research, there was a survey conducted, and for asking AMA providers a bunch of questions. And so we wanted to learn if the provider currently provided housing or services to Indigenous people with diverse abilities, and also learn more about their experience in working with Community Living BC. There was also key informant interviews with Indigenous people with diverse abilities and family members and other key stakeholder groups. The interviews addressed current gaps, barriers, challenges, experience in accessing CLBC reports, supports, and envisioning future models of culturally safe housing. And lastly, we did a thematic data analysis. So based on the key informant interviews conducted, several overarching themes emerged that highlighted the gaps and barriers and challenges to inclusive housing. Firstly, the criteria and requirements to become CLBC eligible was identified as a barrier experienced by Indigenous people with diverse abilities, and specifically, the requirement to be diagnosed before the age of 18 was a huge barrier. In addition to, long wait lists and the high cost of diagnosis. It was also noted the assessments are traumatic, culturally unsafe, and the paperwork is very challenging to navigate. So we have a quote here from one of the survey respondents. "We work really hard to get assessments done in a timely manner, and then at age 15 or 16 to update those assessments and start the CLBC eligibility process, and making sure that we're on top of those timelines so we don't miss youth that might be eligible. We don't want them to age out without knowing if they are CLBC eligible or not. And when they're not CLBC eligible, that's incredibly frustrating because we know that they need help, and once they turn 19, our hands are tied to provide further supports," which I'm sure a lot of people here have experience with this as well. Another gap was limited access to safe and affordable housing and affordability. Of course, across the board, huge issue. Another barrier was the lack of awareness of CLBC supports and services, particularly for First Nations communities living on reserve. And the provider funding and referral process was another challenge. The reliance on short-term or patchwork funding was expressed by participants as an ongoing concern, as it leads to uncertainty, the need to continuously seek funding to operate, and it hinders the ability to provide consistent services. Racial stereotyping remains a barrier for Indigenous people seeking housing across the board and leads to reluctance to access services and supports. In addition, there were several system-level gaps and challenges that were identified that hinder inclusive housing for Indigenous people with diverse abilities. The system is too challenging to navigate. There are jurisdictional mandate gaps. Youth aging out of the child welfare system tend to fall through the cracks, and youth-specific services are lacking. There's also a lack of quality data for decision-making, as we know, and there's inequity in the BC Housing Registry, which is BC specific, but I'm sure it's relevant in other provinces as well. So as an organization, we encourage more cross-ministerial collaboration and to engage local Indigenous housing experts for guidance on how to build trauma-informed, culturally safe, urban Indigenous solutions. And giving the lead to Indigenous housing experts will result in more equitable, livable, and sustainable communities. So based on those gaps that were identified, AMA members suggested the following ideas to improve access to CLBC supports and services. These are separate from the recommendations, which I'll go through next, but here they are. So fostering more connections between CLBC and AMA provider organizations to establish partnerships and support networks for CLBC clients. Collaborating with housing organizations to house CLBC clients. And I'll note that these are very BC specific, but recommendations that could be applied to other organizations as well. Sharing more information on the referral process was another one to ensure that their clients can access CLBC supports and services. Improving communication with CLBC client family contacts to ensure they are provided with regular updates and information about their family members' care and services. Extending financial support to all CLBC clients, not just those with community inclusion hours. Improve the availability of assessments and financial support for individuals over the age of 19. Increase the availability of liaison positions within organizations to provide support for CLBC clients, reducing the burden on existing administrative budgets. Organizations are using their assets to apply for CLBC supports when there should be specific positions designated for this. And lastly, exploring partnerships for complex needs programs and housing for Indigenous peoples, expanding accessibility and services. And I'll go through the recommendations as well. So after analyzing all research and interview responses, the researchers determined a list of formal recommendations that were actually put forward to CLBC to create actionable change. So the first is to develop comprehensive cultural safety training and accreditation for housing providers to ensure respectful engagement with Indigenous people with diverse abilities. This is for all housing providers. In order to reduce barriers, it was recommended to make changes to the CLBC eligibility criteria, specifically the requirement of needing a diagnosis before the age of 18. So we're hoping that this gets changed. In order to safeguard the future well-being of Indigenous youth with diverse abilities, it was strongly recommended to institute a mandatory requirement for the Ministry of Children and Family Development to actively facilitate access to diagnosis and assessments for Indigenous youth in care. This mandatory approach is essential to ensure that no Indigenous youth within the child welfare system misses out on the lifelong support that they may require. In addition, there needs to be mandatory transition plans to support Indigenous youth with diverse abilities as they approach aging out of care and entering adulthood. So the costs for assessments to get a diagnosis should also be covered by the First Nations Health Authority Health Benefits Program, or transferably to other health programs in other provinces. And currently, these assessments are considered an exclusion and not covered. So that needs to change. And then to further increase cultural safety, CLBC should recruit and hire Indigenous psychologists to support diagnosis and assessment. And with regard to outreach and engagement, it was recommended that a strategy be developed to enhance the awareness of available supports and collaborate with Indigenous partners to indigenize the term diverse abilities. So this will be part of our working group that I'll discuss later. And then with regards to partnerships, CLBC should actively strengthen collaboration with Indigenous organizations and delegated agencies to better support the population. We also need to see more collaboration with housing developments to promote inclusive community living and ensure that the housing is accessible and accommodating for Indigenous individuals with diverse abilities. In order to enhance the availability and quality of culturally safe and inclusive housing options, we need to launch a comprehensive Indigenous housing service provider recruitment campaign and review existing housing provider eligibility criteria. We need to develop a landlord support program and advocate for stackable portable rent supplements. And lastly, I know it's a long list. We know that data is a key part of demonstrating need and ensuring consistent care. And because of this, we need to increase the data collection and quality to ensure a more seamless process where less people fall through the cracks. So what's next? We have a second phase of this project, and it includes two main components. The first part is to develop an implementation action plan. So CLBC and AMA, our organization, have established a joint working group, and that's to advance the recommendations from the report. And we're working collaboratively with partner organizations to develop an implementation action plan. This plan will provide a clear roadmap for executing the recommendations and initiatives, including timelines, responsibilities, key performance indicators, and mechanisms for monitoring and evaluating progress. By creating an actionable strategy, stakeholders can ensure that the vital work of supporting Indigenous peoples with diverse abilities in housing moves from recommendations to tangible and transformative actions. We don't want to publish a report and then everything just gets left there in the report, so we're trying to keep moving and work towards change. The second component of phase 2 is developing a strategy for the Indigenous-led, culturally supportive, inclusive co-housing model, which we'll talk about in the next few slides as well. But this strategy will serve as a practical and evaluative platform to test the feasibility and effectiveness of the model in meeting the housing needs of Indigenous people with diverse abilities. So as I mentioned, a key component of this project was developing the model for culturally supportive housing that goes beyond surface level representations of culture and instead focuses on a more profound commitment to understanding and nourishing resident-specific cultural background. Culturally supportive, inclusive housing is more than just a physical dwelling. It's an inclusive and welcoming space that recognizes and supports the profound connection between Indigenous culture and the physical, spiritual, mental, and emotional well-being of Indigenous individuals. It acknowledges that homes are not just places to live, but are in fact sacred spaces. Culturally supportive, inclusive housing respects the diversity of all Indigenous cultures. It acknowledges that each resident comes from a unique cultural background, and it's the responsibility of service providers to understand and nourish this diversity. So residents in these houses are not just passive recipients, but active participants in their cultural journeys. The service providers are a supporting cast in this journey, guided by residents' needs, preferences, and cultural teachings. This approach fosters a sense of reciprocity and shared learning. We know that cultural teachings are not static. They evolve over time. And so culturally supportive inclusive housing recognizes the need for continuous learning and adaptation, ensuring that access to cultural practices and teachings are supported, fostered, and promoted. Engagement with cultural experts and leaders is approached with respect and humility. Service providers seek guidance on cultural matters and engage in culturally appropriate ways, such as inviting experts for meals or ceremonies. Lastly, This housing involves a commitment to decolonization, actively working to address and rectify the historical injustices faced by Indigenous communities. So in these homes, the residents are not just recipients of care, they're at the circle of a center of care that celebrates their strengths, and their homes become the epicenter of their personal journey. These spaces require a unique relationship with residents, one that empowers them to grow, nourishes their specific cultural identities, and respects their right to self-determine their own health and well-being. And we had 6 key needs that were identified for this model. The first is Indigenous-led. It needs to be Indigenous-led. This approach ensures that the values and traditions and worldviews of Indigenous people are at the forefront of decision-making. The second is meeting people where they're at. This is fundamental to fostering choice and self-determination. The third and fourth are that it must be a culturally safe environment that facilitates access to cultural activities and resources. The fifth is family-friendly, must preserve and foster intergenerational kinship, relationality, connection, and belonging through family-style living. And the last is community inclusive and community engaged. It supports cluster living to ensure Indigenous residents are fully engaged in a diverse and inclusive community. I know I'm almost at my end here, but so this model envisions a supportive living complex that consists of independent units and shared community-style communal gathering spaces, fostering a sense of community while also ensuring that culturally appropriate and supportive services are readily accessible. The residence design promotes intergenerational cluster living, facilitating the coexistence of Indigenous clients, elders, and family members. Additionally, it ensures access to a range of culturally supportive services and programs, land-based activities, elder support, employment and skill training, health and mental health services on site, traditional medicine gardens, and again, family-style living. It's deeply rooted in the principles of Indigenous ways of knowing and being, and promotes the strength of Indigenous-led. So it's clear that the journey towards equitable and culturally safe housing for Indigenous individuals is an ongoing process that demands the collective efforts of multiple provincial system-level partners, including child welfare, education, health, and housing. This collaboration is essential to provide the necessary support, particularly to Indigenous youth and those with complex care needs. By taking action, a collaborative effort can be made to better support housing that respects the right for Indigenous people to self-determine their own housing journeys, thus creating a culturally safe and inclusive home environment for all Indigenous people with diverse abilities. Thank you. Only 1 minute over.
I think you're on to something when your recommendations, when I'm looking out at everybody, and especially the one around like cost of assessments, and everybody's face is just angry. They're like, yeah. So I don't know if you can fold that in your research, but everybody agrees. Angry faces. So thank you. Next, I would like to turn it over to Cheryle Prince and Mandy Scott from the Arch Project in Sudbury. And I will bring you a clicker, and we're going to change the screen. So it'll be 12 seconds.
Okay. Okay, so we're Arch Sudbury, and we're about empowering Indigenous youth transitions. Ani, Cheryle Dishnakas, and I'm the lead for the Arch Project. I work at Niswakamuk Native Friendship Center.
Wache Mandy Scott Dishnakas on Vita Begoch Netushin. I'm the project coordinator with the City of Greater Sudbury, and we work very, very well together. I'm going to whip us through our introduction. This is a quick overview. Oh, shit, guys.
You're not allowed to say that.
Sugar.
Oh, sugar. I forgot to do this part. So there's our names. We will repeat the contact information at the end. And here is the overview. And we will go through a quick introduction. Cheryle will take us through our methods, and we'll share these action research activities and preliminary results that we've been doing. And then we'll talk about our solution and development for easing that transition into emerging adulthood. So first, our intro. I want to give us some context here.
So Nisquakamuk, it means where the three roads meet, and it also is the Ojibwe way for saying Sudbury.
And to contextualize where we're coming from, the City of Greater Sudbury sits on the territory of the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850 and exists within and adjacent to the lands of Atikameksheng, Anishinaabeg, and Wanapitei First Nation. There are 17 First Nation communities within a 2-hour radius of Sudbury, and we sit at the crossroads of two major transportation corridors, and we see a number of people migrating into our city from around rural and remote communities surrounding us to access education and employment opportunities, medical services, and of course, housing. We are the largest urban center in Northern Ontario with a population of just over 166,000 people, covering a very large geographic area by landmass, and we are the largest city in Ontario. And we have over 330 lakes within our city's boundaries, which is amazing. And a giant nickel, that's right.
Largest city by geography.
By geography, yes.
Okay, because I'm not from Ontario. Is that right?
So the City of Greater Sudbury delivers and oversees many homelessness services, including community outreach teams, 3 emergency shelters, drop-in shelter, Housing First program, and transitional housing through our 17 community partners. And we currently have 307 actively homeless on our by names list, of which 85% are chronically homeless, 80% are high acuity, and we know from our partners in Indigenous housing and homelessness, over 50% of those are Indigenous.
This shows a picture of some youth that my coworker took, Daryl Walker, who is the lead for the Wasanabin program, which is for youth.
Age 13 to 18. So one of our many beautiful lakes. So action research on chronic homelessness. I see some other arch buddies out in the crowd. Thank you for coming. There are 8 sites across Ontario. The federal objective is to eliminate chronic homelessness. Our local objective is to prevent Indigenous youth homelessness.
A little bit about ARCH. Our objective is to support and empower Indigenous youth transitioning out of the child welfare systems into adult independence. And our purpose is to decrease Indigenous youth experiences with homelessness after they transition out of care.
And here is our core group. Our leadership team is made of 4 organizations,
which are Nisquakamuk Native Friendship Center, OFIFC, City of Greater Sudbury, and DPRA, which is our development evaluation.
They do a lot of support to help gather this data we're doing. And here are our advisory committee partners. We started with 8 originally, and they are Atikameksheng, Anishinaabeg, Kinnikabeshgami Child and Family Services, Nagda-Windaman Family and Community Services, YMCA, and SASSY, unfortunately, the Sudbury Action Center for Youth, which had a youth shelter, closed its doors in March. But we keep them here out of respect for the work that they did for many decades, and to highlight the fact that we are very much in need in Sudbury for youth services. We also work with Ontario Aboriginal Housing, Children's Aid Society, and Compass. So why did we choose this topic? We're still crunching the numbers from our most recent point in time count this October, but from our data from 2021, we learned from the respondents that 52% first experience of homelessness occurred before the age of 25. That is in the range of youth. 36% had been in foster care or a youth group home, and of those, 58% had been homeless within 1 year of leaving foster care or group home, while 81% of those reported that child protective services were not helpful when transitioning to independence. So we partner with Child Welfare now, and while this data can be harmful or feel kind of bad, our project is very much solution focused. So we have to see what are the problems, what are the challenges, and then work together to move towards solving them. So, are we out of battery? Oh, it's not working. I was going to run through a little brief literature review. There, we're fine. Because we understand through Thistle's work that the factors that contribute to Indigenous homeless are very complex. It's a hugely complex phenomenon that requires an interdisciplinary approach for tackling. And the factors that influence Indigenous homelessness include all of these, which we can skim and scan very quickly. But at the bottom, you'll see child welfare system involvement is a huge factor, and I'm sure many of you are already well aware of 60 Scoop. So homelessness among Indigenous youth in care results from an intersection of those above mentioned factors: a lack of stability from moving between biological and foster families and group homes, and inadequate support during and after care, including weak social networks and supportive relationships. So this is where our solution comes in. Because currently the outcomes for Indigenous youth in care basically involve intergenerational trauma and loss of identity that are core challenges that exacerbate all of these negative outcomes, from education, employment, causing homelessness, incarceration, mental health challenges, substance abuse and addiction, physical health issues, and pregnancy and childbirth. So aging out is a colloquial term used to describe the point in time when youth exit the child welfare system as they reach the age of majority. Oops. Oh yeah, okay, we're fine. Transitioning into adult independence is a process that requires time and preparation, and one that should begin early in life. Aging out places an unrealistic expectation of instant adulthood upon youth exiting child welfare systems. And it's just not the experience of their peers who are not in care, who often have that luxury of having family support and connections well into their 20s, often not moving out until their 30s. And in Indigenous families, this is very much the case. You are always connected to your extended family also. So if the child protection system was a parent, it may well have its own children taken away. This is quite the indictment. This is a quote from my friend and colleague, Jane Kovarakova, who is herself a person with lived experience. She exited child welfare through emancipation and is very well spoken about her experience. And now she works as chief of staff at MCCSS, where she continues to make a huge impact on pushing for better supports for youth transitioning out of care. So what are the best practices? Well, on the right side, we see the equitable standard pillars of support developed through years of work by Melanie Doucette, who I got to meet yesterday. She's currently speaking at another talk right now at the same time. So I was glad to get to meet her. And then her partner, who she's presenting with, helped develop the Ready, Set, Go new ministry standards that were just, implemented last year in April. So they very much align, and they include financial, education and professional development, housing, relationships, culture and spirituality, health and well-being, advocacy and rights, and emerging adulthood development. Our project aims to address relationships, culture and spirituality, and emerging adulthood quite directly. And we want to acknowledge that housing first is a must. We need to build more housing stock. We need to make sure that people are safely housed and then provide these wraparound supports. This is happening in our city through other adjacent projects that are part of our homelessness team. So what we're doing through Arch Sudbury is really to get ready to be able to provide those wraparound supports as that housing stock becomes increasingly available. So as we go forward, I need you to keep our solution and development in focus. Again, our question is, how can we support and empower Indigenous youth transitioning out of child welfare into adult independence? What we want to do is create a new coordinated access system for youth in transition called the EASE Network, Emerging Adult Services for Empowerment Network. We want to ease that transition into adulthood. And to be able to do coordinated access, we need data. So we will create the GRACE database, Growing Response Analytics on Child Welfare Exits. So with ease and grace, we want to be able to wrap around these supports to these youth transitioning out of care. We will also have a navigation coordinator and cultural training for supporting Indigenous youth in transition, and best practices for culture and land-based programming for Indigenous youth in care.
And these are our methodologies, which are Indigenous-led community-driven action research. This shows our partnership, which is cultural alignment and system alignment.
Combining our two organizations, Nisswaukanuk Native Friendship Center and the City of Greater Sudbury. And we are doing participatory action research in an Indigenous-led way. This involves cycles of work of preparation, planning, taking action, reflecting on the effects of the action that we take, and then taking more action. We refine that process as we go along. So I think we're gonna, I saw you roll. We gotta.
I'll keep going.
Oh, okay. Speed it up. Okay. Okay.
So our Indigenous-led, you need to understand the history and politics and effects of intergenerational trauma, appreciating Indigenous culture, traditions, and spirituality, acknowledging and working with Indigenous knowledge keepers, and very important is the trust and respect required.
Absolutely. We're using the USAY research framework developed through the OFIFC. That's the provincial body of Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centers. They've been developing this over the last decade. It includes 4 pillars or principles, which you can see on the right, and you can research more about that on their website. But it basically is the guiding framework that allows our Indigenous partners to be our decision makers and objective setters, and where we honor the OCAP principles of Indigenous data governance.
So some of the learnings,
Go ahead, just keep going.
some of the learnings that we found were relationship building and developing trust is key to beginning work together. Sharing experiences an essential form of knowledge translation, and data transcends quantitatively and qualitatively. Measures includes stories and artistic expressions.
Right. So we're basically doing a 2-eyed seeing approach where we learn to see with one eye the strengths of Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing, and with the other eye, the strengths of Western knowledge and ways of knowing. I might have to get up and just go, or, okay, swap one out. Ta-da! No,
No, it's probably the thing then.
switch out the other one.
Yeah.
You wink at me, I'll press the button.
What?
Oh, no, it's not here.
Oh. Okay, so two-eyed seeings. We're going 2 slides up. Yes, we were just here. Okay, so again, we're using that 2-eyed seeing approach. There you can see this is a method developed in 2012 by Indigenous researchers in New Brunswick. And everything that we've learned has taught us
Is connection to culture is a protective factor against homelessness.
and this is very well studied.
And everything we do is youth-led, elder-supported, land-based learning. And right here is our elder that has been with us since day one, Jeanette McWabi, who is from Sagamok First Nations.
Okay, so again, I'm just going to keep repeating this. This is our solution in development. We're creating the EASE network, the GRACE database, wraparound supports as youth transition into adulthood. So we're going to talk about our action research activities. Here they are. Conversations with advisory committee partners and child welfare organizations. We also conducted a social network analysis, and through Cheryle's work with her team, land-based learning with youth in care, and with adults with lived experience. And upcoming work will include collaboration with Indigenous academic researchers, focus groups with Indigenous youth serving frontline workers to develop best practice tools. We're building a bundle in the EASE network, not only for the youth that will be supported by the EASE network, but also for the workers that work with them. And one hope of mine is that we can also do a pilot collaboration with housing to see how effective our strategies are. Can we prioritize youth housing if we can make sure that these supports are in place? So in our conversations with the advisory committee, we asked, what are the individual and system level challenges in supporting successful youth transitions out of child welfare? We had many discussions with our advisory committee, and we learned that addressing the need for increased collaboration across youth and adult serving organizations was primary. And we also needed to address the lack of engagement from youth in their transition. Once they turn 18, they kind of want nothing to do with child welfare. Some of them remain engaged, and that can sometimes be a barrier for them to access that increased funding from Ready, Set, Go. And in our conversations with child welfare, we needed to ask what data is available and needed to help youth serving agencies support Indigenous youth who have transitioned from care, and what processes are needed to facilitate that data sharing. So we had many one-on-one meetings with both Indigenous and non-Indigenous child welfare agencies, and the challenges were addressing child welfare's mandate to protect client data and also alignment with Indigenous coordinated access best practices.
And our conversations with community partners were community organizations want to have increased collaboration, but organizational mandates and policies are barriers. Data sharing is possible, but requires specific policies and processes. Non-Indigenous child welfare agencies support non-Indigenous youth, which we were surprised to find out.
More of that jurisdictional dispute challenge.
Culturally appropriate services are wanted and needed, such as integrating Indigenous teach-ins into case management.
So again, next on our list was our social network analysis, where we asked which services that support youth transitioning from care are connected, and what is the strength of these connections. So to gather this data, there was some preliminary research in asset mapping, surveys, roundtable gatherings, one-on-one meetings, and an ARCH service navigation simulation. This was for frontline workers to give them the experience of being a youth with certain challenges and trying to navigate accessing services. It was really fun. Mm-hmm. So the challenges that we found involved barriers to coordination and collaboration and gaps in community and support systems.
Which were lack of awareness of the various programs offered by organizations, disconnect due to differences in mandates and privacy policies, and the gaps in the community and system supports were need for affordable transitional housing, opportunities for youth to be youth, importance of youth belonging to a community, which is very important.
So on to the next are the great work that Cheryle's been doing with her team at Nisswaakamak on land-based learning.
So here it shows our traditional lands, which are located in Wanapate. That dock was just put in this year. So some of the questions we explored: what do youth in care need to transition successfully? How does being in care affect the relationship Indigenous youth have to the land and their culture? And how can the relationship the Indigenous youth have to the land and their culture be strengthened to prepare them for transitioning from care? So far, we've had 3 land-based learning insight gatherings. We've had 13 youth so far, which consists of 3 female, 8 male, and 2 spirited. Some of the challenges we have faced were coordinating recruitment with partners and identifying the role of youth workers who are attending with the youth. We had to be assertive with them, having to tell the workers to let the youth speak for themselves. Mm-hmm. In this first picture, we had insight gathering in a classroom setting. And right from there, we realized that we need to have them on land because they feel more comfortable to share with us. These are more pictures of the land. That arbor was built by previous students who also attend Nisswakmak Native Friendship Center. Our elder is there to support if any triggers happen while the youth are sharing with us. Here's some of the food that we gave to the youth while they were there, and this is our walking path. These art and crafts were done by the youth. So we learned that if you give the youth something to do with their hands, they're more willing to share with us.
Their story.
Their stories. So these are some of the gifts that we gave to the youth for coming to the Insight gatherings. The other picture of the rock is a brain and money sign, because they said, though, you need education and money to transition into adulthood. So the lessons learned were land-based learning is key for making youth feel comfortable. Elders need to be involved and be given a clear role in the activities. Youth prefer a small number of simple questions, and youth are not accessing culture-based programs available from the Indigenous child welfare agencies because of the stigma that follows them. They don't want to be.
Hence the need for additional community-based, culturally appropriate programming for them.
Yes.
So in the next one is the land-based learning with adults with lived experience.
So the same questions we ask them, what do youth need to transition successfully? How does being in care affect the relationship of Indigenous youth, have to the land and the culture, and how can the relationship the Indigenous youth have to the land and their culture be strengthened to prepare them for transitioning from care? So this was artwork done by an adult with lived experience. It shows a storytelling, which is from them being in care to where they are now.
And this was from the group that is currently homeless. And you will be working with another group that are currently housed.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So what I'm really excited about is she's also developing an aunties and uncle program, wherein, just like big brothers and big sisters, you know, you need some mentorship, some relationship building that will help you to learn what are
life skills.
Exactly.
Simple life skills.
So our solution in development, again, is creating this ease and grace network. So there are many moving pieces. We're going to go flip quickly. Again, we're doing 2 streams, cultural alignment, to bring it all into this new coordinated, Indigenous-led coordinated access system so that the youth can receive these wraparound services. And you can see there's lots of moving pieces here. We're going to have our community partners. I want them to come from every sector. Currently at the top left, you see that those are the ones represented by our advisory committee, including housing and homelessness, Indigenous services and programs, mental health, youth services, and child welfare, which is very important. But we need everybody at the table. And we'll need a database. And what we've learned is that we can actually really customize the use of HIFAs such that we can input, this is going to be consent-based, goals-based, strength-based data entry that comes first from child welfare. And then it's our partners in the EASE network will work with this to engage in collaborative case management, where we would input the progress towards their goals in terms of our medicine wheel teachings. And then as part of this is we will also have a transition navigation coordinator who will handle managing the network, but also ensuring that quality assurance that the partners are responding and providing the services requested by these youth. So this is where we're at in the process. It's all about data sharing agreements. As far as I know, we're the first group to successfully get a buy-in from child welfare to agree to share data with us. And the reason is they're 18. they are adults. They are consenting to release that data. We don't want case notes, case history. I don't want to know what crimes you broke when you were 14, or nothing like that. It's all about your vision for your future and getting you housed and retaining that housing. So providing all of those wraparound supports so that they can actually do that. And what we learned from our sense-making workshop in August, where we presented all of this data to our advisory committee, is there are 3 major opportunities given everything that we've learned. We need to provide youth in care with opportunities to connect with community and culture and increase that collaboration and coordination among service providers, while we also increase awareness of programs for youth. And a summary, very quick summary of our lessons, our results to date in terms of cultural alignment.
Build a stronger sense of belonging by deepening their connections to Indigenous culture and communities. Develop personal skills and capabilities through culturally grounded programming. And last, establish natural support networks of family, friends, and community members who can provide ongoing mentorship and care.
And in terms of systems alignment, when youth seek support from community agencies, they're waiting anywhere from 3 to 6 weeks for a response. So we're going to change that. To be part of the EASE network, we will have a memorandum of understanding that involves a rapid response to requests for services. So we also learned that child welfare agencies have limited engagement with youth after they transition, and there are regulations that prevent them from sharing information with external agencies that may be supporting youth following their transition. This lack of communication means other agencies are unaware of the youth's experience with child welfare because they might not even want to disclose that. Once they're 18, don't want to talk about it. But it's helpful though. And when we have the EASE network operating, hopefully in the next year, then we can know how many youth are exiting care this month or this quarter. Okay, let's get ready to wrap those support services around them. So that's everything. That brings us to this unique fusion of culture and system alignment.
And we want to say miigwech.
Mega miigwech.
And again, here's our contact info if you want to know more.
Yeah, we'd love to engage some knowledge exchange. We want to learn as much as possible. Thank you.
That was pretty awesome. And I had to point out, in a sector of just terrible acronyms, grace and ease is really good.
I prayed for that. I put my tobacco down and asked for how can we best create a platform for supporting these youth in transition.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
So thank you again. Last but not least, and I promised I wouldn't read any bio pieces, but I'm going to introduce Kayla Weber, and I will just say that Kayla is a PhD candidate, and I find that to be remarkably impressive. So University of Toronto.
Thank you. Okay, thanks.
All you.
I didn't know if I wanted to go up or sit. I feel like it's up to you. Yeah. I think I'll stand and maybe come back. Why not?
Yeah.
Depending how I'm feeling.
How the spirit moves you.
Do you want me to get rid of?
I think I have space. Does this a laptop need to be on for this to be on? Okay, that's fine too.
Do you want to bring over a chair?
No, I'm okay. Usually when I'm teaching, I usually don't like to lecture, but I've been sitting down and taking in so much information that I always feel awkward transitioning into a next, there's time to pause and revisit. So it's on to the next, on to the next, on to the next. There's so much information. But I'll just introduce myself. My name's Kayla Weber. I'm a PhD candidate in University of Toronto, Department of Social Justice. And I'm also a part-time faculty member at U of T. I teach Black and Indigenous education. So I'm coming at this with a very different lens. Chris kind of joked about that. He's like, what can you do in terms of housing and rebuilding homes? I was born in and raised in the area of Little Jamaica and Eglinton West. It's a community in Toronto where it's highly gentrified. We're seeing a lot of changes with the LRT, the transit systems. It's an area where a lot of residents are being pushed out. It's an area where, when it comes to the city, that we have a lot of folks who leave the reserve usually live within either to Scarborough or Little Jamaica area, and folks who intersect with the identity of being Black and Indigenous, usually Mohawk or Ojibwe or Cree, and are usually Jamaican or of Afro-Caribbean descent as well. So we see that in our communities. So my generational work and community commitments addresses housing precarity and Black and Indigenous kinships, communities, and solidarities, models of wellness and anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, climate change, gender-based violence, and transformative justice. I'm also a stakeholder for the anti-Black racism unit for the City of Toronto. So I didn't have any slides because this is preliminary work I'm doing. So I want to be careful of kind of what I'm sharing. I'm engaging with community members right now, speaking, visiting, having meals. It's very important for me to do that work. So my working title right now is called Our Future Matters, Rebuilding Homes and Communities from with Black, Afro-Indigenous, and Indigenous Communities. My work in community is guided by Dr. Eve Tuck, who's a Luton scholar. She's Alaska Native. Dr. Jennifer Brandt, who is Mohawk, and Dr. Karen Recollet, who's Cree, and the fourth reader will be a Black woman. So I have some really strong Black and Indigenous women leading this work, and I'm so honored that they, with a Black and Indigenous feminist lens of what rebuilding homes looks like, what matrilineal looks like, what's the meaning of grassroots organizing, and when we think about rebuilding homes. So I just extend, my knowledge and invitation with all the writers that I'm engaging with across the world internationally. I'm not too sure if we can dim the lights a bit. I was thinking, I would like to make this, an interactive conversation so that you too are part of these conversations. So I would like you to engage in exercise during the presentation of interweaving to describe or illustrate your ideal home. So what comes into thinking about home? What does it look like to think about what the first thing you would need for a home? Is it the materiality of your home that's important to you? Is it the area of location? Is it design? Feel free to list and draw. This will be an artifact of your being and present in this room. You can close your eyes to really visualize and think about that. And these are some of the questions that I've engaged and co-theorized with participants with to think about what the design would be. So while engaging in this thought project, I'll tell you when I'll get to the first question. I'll do a little bit of kind of my positioning. I enact in the action of visiting with community, organizations and grassroots movement that provide firsthand information about the lived experiences, stories, and advocacy efforts of Black and Indigenous communities regarding housing concerns. This engagement has engaged and continues to engage the research, which is grounded in the voices and matters of the interviewed communities. Visiting is based on consent, openness to knowing and unknowing, and a willingness to receive visits as gifts. In the research project, I adopted visiting as an Indigenous feminist practice to shape the approach to relationships with participants. I thought about how I would like to approach my relationship with participants and community members from Black and Indigenous communities with the mindset of being a visitor. In addition, I recognize I'm entering their space, and in turn, I'm responsible for honoring and respecting their experiences and knowledge mobilization. A Cree scholar and community member activist, Karen Recollet, when I'm thinking about ethical citational practices, something I'm thinking about while rebuilding homes is thinking about more than non-human kin. So how are we also engaging with folks who are non-human kin, trees, rocks, the water, the stories that are buried under these lands, some of them that we are still discovering. So how are we engaging with not just the structure of a home, but our relatives that are also non-human kin that are part of that process as well. My approach is grounded in theories of radical planning, matrilineal planning, and Black and Indigenous feminist planning. I want to just disrupt also to my work. I disrupt the labeling and dismantling the words of vulnerability and damage-centered research. So damage-centered research, EVTUC calls on communities, researchers, and educators to reconsider the long term of damage-centered research that intends to document people's pain and brokenness, to hold those in power accountable for their oppression. The kind of research operates with a flawed theory of change. It is often used to leverage reparations or resources for marginalized communities, yet seamlessly reinforces and reinscribes a one-dimensional notion of these people as depleted, ruined, and hopeless. EVTUC urges communities to insinuate a damage-centered research to reformulate the ways research is framed and conducted, and to reimagine how findings might be used by, for, and with community. I also disrupt the word vulnerability in the book called Reclaiming Indigenous Planning. They quote by Ryan Walker, "We raise concerns, however, that such efforts may actually be hampered rather than helped by the uptake of the vulnerability label. This label and what it implies can be internalized by those targeted to receive them. The Oxford Dictionary includes synonyms of the term vulnerable that include damaged, helpless, powerless, and weak. Uptake of the vulnerability label may therefore mean adopting to identity of victimization, disempowerment, and dependency. Identities that can be linked to legacies and experiences that Canada's Indigenous peoples are actively seeking to counter and rectify. We caution against the uncrucial use of vulnerability to characterize Indigenous communities who are now confronting these challenges, and urge those involved in social dimensions of climate change research to reconsider and interrogate how such a label might reinforce historically uneven relationships of power and dependency. It is important to note that we are not calling for complete abandonment of the term. However, we do encourage greater consideration of the subjective and individualized understanding of what vulnerability may or may not entail. Whiteness and white streaming are fundamental elements of policy about housing that are based on dominant norms, not necessarily what Indigenous communities want or need. Many Black residents were labeled as those people who live in that housing. My research undertakes several theoretical and practical approaches to tackling the traditional and contemporary conception of home and its role in housing Black, Indigenous, and Afro-Indigenous communities in Canada. I plan to bring the matrilineal planning, grassroots organizing, Black and Indigenous Housing Alliance signaling a paradigm shift in how housing policy is usually approached. My intended research moves away from traditional power structures and embraces community-driven approaches. By acknowledging the strength and unity and richness of kinship, the project strives to create plans for transformative spaces where Black and Indigenous communities, resurgence, stories, and togetherness can thrive and flourish. Through these efforts, my project seeks to challenge existing narratives and co-create a future where mutual understanding and respect pave the way for ethical, inclusive, and harmonious collective living communities. The first question I want you to think about: when you think of home, what images, memories, feelings, smells come to mind? And I'll give you some time. The second question is, with this in mind, what would the design of your dream home look like? So I'll repeat the first two questions again. When you think of home, what images, memories, feelings, smells come to mind? With this in mind, what would the design of your dream home look like? So please feel free to think about that and kind of tune me out as I kind of do to timing. You know, Black and Indigenous communities in Toronto and various provinces in Canada are invisible to the education, justice, housing, social services, and healthcare system. Canada's government and colonial state have and continue to contribute to racial hierarchies that compound patriarchy, oppression for Black and Indigenous communities to understand the real lived experiences and stresses placed on Black and Indigenous communities, including women and children. There's limited access to education, housing precarity, food security, and police violence and gender-based violence in both communities. These communities have traditionally built kinship, and these kinships continue today. Instead, this work is about reviving, renewing, re-listening, reacting, and re-loving. With over 400 years of African diaspora presence in Canada, relationships between Black and Indigenous peoples offered a form of resistance against colonial oppression. Moreover, they gave both these communities a chance to survive. When we think about colonialism, transplanted Western land and property ownership concepts to Black and Indigenous peoples, communities, before colonialism, Black and Indigenous communities had a community view of a home and healthy home. This community-based view of home and community was overtaken by Western colonialism and capitalism, resulting in slavery, land dispossession, displacement of Black communities through the Atlantic slave trade, both anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism, as well as the possession and ownership of Indigenous land. Under capitalism, the concept of property stems from colony, the robbery of Indigenous land, and the continuation of robbery of Indigenous land, and the disposals of Black and Indigenous peoples. Black and Indigenous and Afro-Indigenous futurities require the destruction of reconceptualizing property rights, eliminating property ownership and restoring homes and community. Something that a Cree scholar and community member reminds me of, the relationship of Indigenous peoples' experiences of colonialism and anti-colonial work for self-determinism is linked to Black people's liberation, freedom, and flourishing. The second question I want you to think of, how could a reconceptualization of home encompass the home place, meaning emotional, spiritual, environmental, non-human kin, and community dimensions of the home? When you think of a home, do you think of a single dwelling or a community of homes? The next is, what does the community look like? Again, due to timing is funny. You never have enough time. So as I engage in this work, the research design that I'm taking, again, is, as I alluded before, it is building relationships and interacting with communities. I am working in sharing conversations with Black and Indigenous architects, Black and Indigenous women who have continued to organize and protest around that aspect of housing. This is not a new idea at all. Talking to housing workers who are Black and Indigenous or who work with Black and Indigenous communities, talking to folks who are social workers, speaking to executive directors of friendship centers, of the aspect of home and lived experiences. So in this project, generational project, I should say, what I'm trying to learn is how and why Black and Indigenous and Afro-Indigenous individuals and communities face housing precarity. So meaning homelessness, temporary housing, couch surfing, unsafe housing, inaccessible housing. And they also face discrimination, as well as what the future should bring, needs to bring, and what will it look like? What does Black, Indigenous, and Afro-Indigenous housing mean to you? How do you think re-envisioning housing can and will impact Black, Indigenous, and Afro-Indigenous futurities? Lastly, the ultimate goal of my research design is to contribute to better policy development. The research aims to address systemic issues and drive positive social change within the housing sector. Some of the follow-up phase I have folks think about as we're co-theorizing these conversations. Another way to think about that is that not all housing is approached or viewed similarly. There is no grassroots orientation of housing. It is rooted primarily in capitalist private property values. What would it look like if Black, Indigenous, and Afro-Indigenous women with housing developers and urban planners were to develop housing beyond the current capitalist notion of housing? What would housing look like if we had a radical matrilineal approach to housing? And how do we create and recreate a home? Again, I'm almost done. Some of the questions I ask participants is tell me about your role at this organization in relationship to housing. Why do you feel housing precarity in the form of inadequate housing is a persistent issue in Canada? How can policymakers, housing developers, governments, citizens, and other stakeholders collaborate with Black, Indigenous, and Afro-Indigenous communities to create housing that meets their expectations, visions, and futurity? The next is I engaged with the family who they were the first Black and Mi'kmaq family to acquire land in the area of Scarborough, Ontario. And there was lots of protests to remove this family from where they were living and the anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism they were facing. So I'm engaging with this family as 3 generations actually of these conversations of thinking about recreation of home and what does land mean to as a Black Mi'kmaq person. The last question I have is what would you need your home to include to feel like a home place you would want to return to at the end of the day? So if we think about some of the key takeaways when you're, imagining or describing or have a laundry list, what was the first thing you thought about or what took the longest? Was it the design? Was it the materiality? Was it locations? Was it determining where your room would be located? Did you just want to have a home to begin with? Do you think about insecurity or security? Did you think about the design of the kitchen? Or what was hard about it to even imagine what your home would look like? So I will just close this off by saying, in closing, doing this work on Black and Indigenous rebuilding homes brings the eminence of collaboration, co-creation, and co-visioning, a future rooted in the community that delves deep into the real lived experiences and is transformed through radical love into empowerment and freedom. The concept of property has played a complex and often oppressive role in the history of Black and Indigenous communities. Throughout history, private property has been used to justify the forced removal of Indigenous peoples from their lands and the enslavement and exploitation of Black peoples. As a result, dismantling the property concept is often seen as a necessary step in rebuilding homes and communities with and from Black and Indigenous communities. However, when property is used to justify the exclusion of others from access to land and resources, it becomes a tool of oppression. The use of property has been particularly true for Black and Indigenous communities who have faced centuries of dispossession and exploitation at the hands of colonial powers and capitalist system that prioritize private property rights over the collective well-being of communities. In addition, it may be necessary to rethink how property is constructed and enforced to restore homes and communities for Black and Indigenous people. In all cases, it will be paramount to prioritize Black, Afro-Indigenous community voices and perspectives which must be central to any efforts to rebuild their homes and communities. In addition, the strategies may involve efforts to dismantle the structural barriers that prevent Black and Indigenous people from accessing political and economic power. In addition, these strategies may involve addressing the ongoing impacts of colonialism and systemic racism. Only by focusing on the needs and perspectives of these communities can we truly work towards a different future. So I'd love to hear if anybody would like to describe their home. And due to timing, I'd love to hear from one person. Even the color of the bathroom that you would want to choose. These are things I ask community members as well. Yes, I saw a hand.
I kind of just imagine like a cozy little place with lots of little shelves and I'm a collector.
I love that.
Crafter, so do that. And then somebody to come in and clean this.
Nice. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, thank you. So we have, I'd say, 6 minutes-ish for questions. So given that we don't have a handheld mic to go around, if you have a, oh, we do. Oh, fantastic. And, you don't want to hand out the mic, Tessa?
Yeah, totally.
Oh, sweet. So does anyone have a question for any of the awesome presenters? Yeah.
There's one question.
One question. We have a microphone coming.
Can you just give a better definition of matrilineal housing and what you mean by that?
I guess we can. Oh. I'm very on to. Okay. Yeah. So, of course, matrilineal is not a new term, but in terms of matrilineal and radical planning of a lot of different works of looking at protest, of how Black and Indigenous women have used protest in terms of demanding housing rights in building community, in building libraries for children. Black and Indigenous women have always protested when it came to housing. So when I think about radical and coming up with this term of matrilineal planning, when I was doing the research and engaging and co-theorizing with participants, that's where this came from, of how Black Indigenous women continue till this day to have a perspective of what they think is best. And they know what's best when it comes to planning. And I think about Toronto, like that city, I'm from Toronto, and who was the urban planners behind that? Like, they did a really crappy job, but what would it look like if Black and Indigenous women planned their own communities? It would be a different place, a different future. And this is not new work. It's a continuing of reviving that work and acknowledging who's part of that work. Because Indigenous women have been at the tables protesting when things were, going on, and they still are. It's not the men, it's the women. Always the women doing that work.
Thank you for that question. The natural rule is if you had that question, other people did too. They just weren't brave enough to ask it. Oh my gosh, you're good.
Hi, I just had, oh, is it still working?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
No, you have to come up front and ask questions. Yeah.
Wait, for real?
No,
Oh.
just yesterday.
Yeah, just
Yeah.
yesterday. I was just gonna say, I really resonated with the conversation you were talking about Eglinton, because I grew up in Gin and Finch, and I know like kind of the similar things are happening in my community with the whole gentrification process. And I know a lot of people were displaced from their homes in terms of the community housing and things of that nature. And when you brought up the topic of, visualizing our ideal home, one of the things that came to mind was I remember growing up in my neighborhood. It was very communal. Like the whole neighborhood knew each other. You could go outside, kids were playing. If you needed, something, borrow something from your neighbor, you could do that. And moving to the suburbs, like when I got older, that I kind of lost touch with that. None of that was prevalent. So I really resonated when you were talking about connecting back to the land and even having the familial kinfolk with like just your environment. But one of the things I found difficult as well is like growing up in that community and neighborhood, with the whole industrialization process culturally, like there is a cultural and spiritual aspect where many of us are connected to the land. But I think through that process, we lose touch with that. So I guess my question would be, how do you foresee bringing that connection to the land back when you're, looking for housing planning and things like that in like a more metropolis city like Toronto?
I guess I can. Is that so? Oh no. So, still works? Hello? Okay. Well, I used to act, so I'll just use my drama voice then. Projecting. That's a really good question. And I think for me, still, as this is like in the early stage of the research I definitely would love to build a housing lab down the line to really think about that. But I'm working with some phenomenal, both Black and Indigenous organizations who are thinking about community land trust and thinking about how it, intersects with land, creating. When I think about the Humber River in Ontario, in the back there are a lot of land-based teachings that are ran by Inagbi, which is located in the Western Road region. But I think this is something that I'm still trying to see what the research and those conversations brings, along with, I think I can't do this work on my own. There's so much work to do, but that's why in having those collective conversations with folks who are engaging in land trust, who are engaging with, land back as well, thinking about what does that mean when we say land back. Also thinking about environmental racism. So were these, structures being built, and are they being upkeep as well when we think about TCHC, Toronto Community Housing Corporation? I'll give you an example. Indigenous youth, if they move from through my interviews, from the reserve to the city of Toronto, what ends up happening is TCHC has certain amount of units for Indigenous youth, but what's happening is that they're located in areas that have a lot of drugs that are happening, and they're saying, why am I being treated to be moved here when I need a space for healing and land-based teachings? I still want to be in the city, but this is not a healthy environment for me to be in. So there's this form of, the way that they described was, I feel like I'm, garbage. I'm garbage. I'm an afterthought. I'm not human. It's like this form of ghettoization as well. And these redlining practices that come in place as well. So I think there's a lot of, as I go through this research, I'm not going to have probably one definition answer today, but I can tell you there's lots of people like the Urbanism Toronto, Black Urbanism TO, who's doing that work in Little Jamaica of looking at community land trusts. Dr. Lynn Jones in Nova Scotia, who's looking at community land trusts. Indigenous women who are looking at, what does an urban reserve look like within the city of Toronto? So these are different things of thinking about like rebuilding homes. Yes.
So I just want to say thank you for that. I don't want to take up too much space either, but one of the things I also wanted to mention was I remember when I was still in high school, one of the things that the community implemented was a community garden.
Mm-hmm.
And it was Black owned and Black Creek. And
Yeah.
I remember we helped start it out, and it was like, you're 15, so you didn't really appreciate it as much as you did afterwards. But I think that was a beautiful way, to kind of bring back the connection you talked about.
Mm-hmm.
But we were growing everything ourselves. It was all organic. And we would give it back to the community.
Of
so
course.
I thought that was dope.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. We're getting the wrap it up signal from the back. Thank you.